Hey guys, Chris here, enemy Ukrainian Canadian. Today is February 27th, 2024. And let's get to the news happening in Ukraine, shall we? So let's get to the good news first. And yet again, the Russians have lost two SU-34s today. It's been confirmed by the Ukrainian Air Force. And so far, the month of February of 2024 has been the most disastrous month for the Russian Air Force so far. So again, two Su-34 bombers that were lost today. And last week, you guys remember that the Russians lost not only an Su-34, I believe it was on Friday, but an A-50, a super plane, a spy plane that the Russians were utilizing. And this has been, honestly, it's very difficult to track at this point, but close to a dozen airplanes that the Russians have lost, jet fighters and airplanes this month alone. So this has been very, very disastrous for them. And I think part of the reason why the Russians are willing to be very risky with the utilization of these planes is because they're trying to push as hard as possible in Avdiivka. And the Su-34s, of course, are bombers that are currently utilizing the FAB 500 bombs, which have a very high yield of destructive power. And they have been creating a lot of problems for the Ukrainians, especially around Avdiivka. The Ukrainians have been mentioning a lot that these bombs are very destructive and they have brought a lot of casualties on the Ukrainian side, unfortunately. So the Russians are willing to take the risk to fly these Su-34s much closer to their front line to dump these bombs and destroy well-defended Ukrainian positions. You can see that in Avdiivka, it's very, very difficult for the Ukrainians right now. The Russians are putting a lot of pressure, and you can see as well that they've managed to take control over some key small villages outside of Avdiivka. In the south of Avdiivka, they've taken control of Severne. In the middle, Lastochkine, and upwards is Stepove, which has been fought by the Ukrainians and Russians for the last few months. And the Russians took control of Stepove a few days ago. And now they're continuing their push towards Berdichi. So you can see that I think the Ukrainians most likely will retreat back into the heights close to Umanske, Semenivka, Berdichi, which gives them a height advantage. And also there's different obstacles. You can see there's reservoirs, small streams and rivers, which will make it far more complicated for the Russians to cross here. So I think this is the new sort of line where the Ukrainians are going to be able to stabilize the situation. From Umanske, Yasnobrodivka, all the way up to Pervomaiske, I think this is kind of the new line of defense that the Ukrainians will have to retreat back to. However, it's very unfortunate because we've been talking about Ukraine needing to build fortifications, trenches like the Russians did in Zaporizhia, and this seems to not have been done in Avdiivka. They had months to prepare for this, and I don't understand why this wasn't done. So it's very unfortunate that it seems that there was very little resources poured in here to build trenches and lines of defense, mine the fields to make a Russian advance very complicated. And especially since October of last year, it was evident that the Russians would do everything possible to capture Avdiivka with the amount of resources they poured into Avdiivka. So, I'm very baffled by the lack of trenches outside of Avdiivka and fortifications and minefields. But hopefully the Ukrainian forces will be able to stabilize the situation here. It's not easy either because one of the main reasons is also Ukraine is not getting the amount of ammunition it was receiving last year. And so the Ukrainians have to be very conservative with the utilization of artillery right now. And they're simply not capable of fending off these massive Russian waves of attack with FPV drones alone. So it makes it very complicated right now. So hopefully we can only hope that the United States will step in, but as the days go by, it becomes less and less likely. And I'll talk a little bit about it a little bit later, but that's the situation for Avdiivka. The Russians are putting pressure, and hopefully, as I've mentioned, the Ukrainians will be able to stabilize the situation in the heights that they have currently around Semenivka. In the north, it's Novobakhmutivka. There's some good positions that the Ukrainians can take, and quite urban areas and settlements that will provide them some good cover and defensive lines that they can be positioned in. So that's the situation for Avdiivka. Around Avdiivka, again, the Russians are also pushing around Marinka with very little gains here. And another front that the Russians are trying to break through is Robotine. So this is basically the Russians trying to reverse the Ukrainian gains in the summer counteroffensive of 2023. And so far, they've managed to break through a little bit, but they're still having a lot of difficulty with taking the village of Robotene. And part of it being is that the Ukrainians have an overwhelming FPV drone advantage here. So even if the Russians are able to enter Robotene, which has been the case in the last few days, the Ukrainians are capable of really hitting these Russian units with FPV drones, and there's absolutely no way for them to evacuate. So the Russians are still incapable right now of taking Robotene, but the pressure keeps accumulating in this direction as well. And additionally, one last little update in the map is Krinke. So the left bank of Kherson, the Russians are furious because the Ukrainians have extended their reach and their positions between Krinke and Kozachi Lahiri. More towards Kozachi Lahiri, the Ukrainians have managed to push out the Russians here. So at this stage, I think it's very clear that the Ukrainians are just trying to hold position and draw as many Russian resources as possible. Breakthrough here is not very likely for the Ukrainian side because they simply don't have the resources and forces to do so. But it's just to keep a certain Russian presence here so they don't get, rotated to other directions such as Robotene or maybe Vuhledar or Avdiivka or even more north in Kupiansk. So this is the main goal of these Ukrainian Spartans right now. They're holding the line and trying to, wreak havoc on Russian positions here. And also the Ukrainian FPV drone units are also being very effective at hitting Russian armored vehicles further away from Krinke in the left bank. So that's pretty much the situation on the map. And the north of Ukraine, again, there's not much to say. The maps haven't really changed in the last few weeks. The Russians continue to apply pressure around the area of Kupiansk, but there haven't been any major gains by the Russians in the last few days/weeks here. But another push that the Russians are doing right now is towards Chasiv Yar in the northern outskirts of Bakhmut. Right now, it's very slow gains by the Russians, but from what I've heard, Chasiv Yar has been prepared for an eventual potential Russian advancement, and there's a lot of lines of fortifications and defenses that have been prepared in case that the Russians have success in the north of Bakhmut. But so far, again, the gains are very small and at a great cost for the Russians. So before I end this video, there's two things I want to talk about. First of all, Macron, the French president, came out with an announcement today about creating a coalition to supply the Ukrainians with missiles, long-range missiles, and bombs to help the Ukrainians, which is a great initiative. And also he talked about basically not ruling out the deployment of his troops to ensure that Russia doesn't win in Ukraine. Now, I think that the second point is more of a discussion starter rather than a commitment from France. I think that it's just Macron trying to bring this topic up and get the population to talk about this because it's very important. We don't know what's going to happen in the next few months. And I think that NATO needs to start thinking that perhaps if Russia, let's say, doesn't just continue attacking Ukraine, but attacks another NATO country, is NATO really going to step in? And I think these conversations need to start happening right now. And I think that part of these 2 points that he brought up, I believe it was yesterday, was the fact that we see a United States that is becoming more politicized, especially this year. There's absolutely, I think, no way in the nearby future that the United States will pass this $60 billion bill because it's the election year and the Republicans will do everything possible to block this military assistance package just to make Biden look bad. And so unfortunately, until November 2024, the United States will provide very minimal aid to Ukraine, in my opinion. And God knows what's going to happen if Trump gets elected. I hope that doesn't happen, but the unpredictability of a Trump administration is certainly making countries like France very wary of the future, and they start understanding the importance of reinvesting back into the military and spending more on their militaries. So this is a good sign because countries like France, Germany, the UK, the Baltics, Finland, Sweden have really stepped it up. By the way, congratulations again to Sweden for being admitted to NATO. This is a huge blow for Putin. But these are very important conversations to be had. And thankfully, Macron is leading the way. So we see emergence in Europe and understanding that they need to start investing right now, because if they don't do it, it might be too late when Russia attacks a NATO country. So let me know what you guys think about the Macron announcement in regards to putting, boots in the front line. I don't think it's going to happen, but I'm glad that these conversations are brought up right now and that he's not, ruling this out either. And last thing I want to talk about is, let's go back to the main slide, some interesting news from Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka is ending the visas for hundreds of thousands of Russians that are staying there to avoid war. So what happened in Sri Lanka is that there's been a lot of complaints that some Russian tourists, and let me remind you that there's around 280 to 300,000 Russians that pretty much escaped Russia to flee the mobilization. They went to Sri Lanka, and now these Russian tourists have been running unregistered and illegal businesses in the southern part of the country. Some raids were conducted by the Sri Lankan authorities, and they found out that some of these Russian-run businesses have a whites-only policy that strictly bars locals. These businesses include bars, restaurants, water sports, and vehicle hiring services. So can you believe the audacity and the arrogance of the Russians that are moving out from another country, from Russia, to escape the mobilization, escape this hellhole that is called Russia, only to continue with the same chauvinistic, racist mentality in Sri Lanka? It's absolutely mind-boggling. And many of them are just absolutely unapologetic about it. And so these types of Russians are really the worst of the worst. They're despicable. And this is what we have to deal with. There's going to be millions of these Russians that have these mindsets. They've escaped the mobilization, and they've escaped it only because they don't want to fight, but they very much support the war in Ukraine. They very much support the genocide of the Ukrainians. And what would stop them from doing the same thing in Sri Lanka, right? Saying that now we need to protect our Russian people that moved to Sri Lanka, right? So I think that the government in Sri Lanka really sees that and is trying to avoid war because of that. Because who knows, Putin could use the same playbook he's been using in Georgia, in Ukraine, in other countries to pull this off in Sri Lanka as well. So I wanted to share this story with you guys. Let me know what you think in the comment section. A huge thank you for support for my channel, but also for the Ukrainian people. Please continue donating for the fundraisers for Ukrainian FPV drones and other humanitarian aid. The Ukrainians absolutely need your help right now. So huge thank you for all of you that are supporting Ukraine. And I will see you guys in the next one. Slava Ukraini!